last speaker, so we're going to take a big step back and talk about the big picture, as if we haven't been talking big picture enough yet. Every week, I write a letter to my readers and help them make sense of the time we live in, and the insight that I try to hammer in over and over and over again is that the world always makes sense if we can see it from the right perspective. Yeah, and I think that's kind of an encouraging thought, isn't it? Because lately the world hasn't made much sense. And it hasn't been that long since, we thought we lived in a world where Brexit was never going to happen, where Donald Trump was unelectable. Remember that world? Where globalisation was irreversible, and where facts were incontrovertible. It turns out we don't live in that world. And so we spend a lot of time right now trying to figure out, well, then what world do we live in? Travel. Travel has always been this powerful technology by which we gain some perspective on the time we're in. We step back from the confusions and that are blocking our sight, and we can see the world more clearly. And we would love to travel somewhere and see these present political and social confusions more clearly. The problem is that these confusions now, they are global. Right? It doesn't matter if we're here in Cairns or back home in my Canada, in Mexico or Melbourne. The big headlines that confuse us are the same. Populism, AI, the rise of robots, terrorism, sexual harassment. We live in a global moment now, and there is nowhere on earth that we can go to step outside of these shocks. Nowhere in space. But maybe we can travel in time. And that's my secret. That's how last year I predicted Brexit, I predicted Trump, and I continue to try to make sense of the time we live in with the benefit of history. And I want to take you back on a trip to a point in history that I think helps us to make sense of a lot of things that are happening in the world right now. And that time is the Renaissance. But before we go, a couple of caveats. One, by Renaissance, I don't mean to take us just to a point when classical art was flourishing in Italy. And I don't mean to take us back to a uniquely European moment in history either. I mean, let's not forget that whether it was the Spanish encounter with the Aztecs, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, the rise of the Mughal Empire, right? Or even the Chinese invention of paper, which spread to the Middle East, to Al-Andalus, and from there to Germany at a very important time to help Johannes Gutenberg. The Renaissance, belonged to and touched the entire world. Where I want to take you to is a time from about 1450 to 1550, into which the medieval world disappeared, and out from which our modern world somehow emerged. And what happened there in the middle, in that Renaissance moment? Well, and some of this may start to sound familiar, a new medium suddenly changed how the world creates and shares information. Gutenberg's printing press, it flipped the economics and habits of information from scarcity to radical abundance. And the defining characteristic of this new print medium was the speed with which it spread. 100 million books. That's how many were printed in the first 50 years of the printing press. So that parents who had grown up having never seen a book had children for whom they were an ordinary part of their everyday lives. 1,500 years of writing were printed in 25 years, and then that total was printed again over the next 25, so that data began to grow exponentially. And what else happened in this Renaissance moment? New maps. This was when the voyages of discovery completely reshaped political and economic maps of the world. This was the best map of the world that Europe had access to before the Renaissance. The Indian Ocean was landlocked. Africa had no southern tip, and the Americas didn't even exist yet. And yet within just a few decades, the voyages of Vasco da Gama, of Magellan, of Christopher Columbus, gave us this map, still the basic template for our maps today, and put the world's precious resources into global motion for the very first time. This was the first globalization. And it made big winners along the new ocean trade routes and big losers along the old Silk Roads. And that duality was a key feature of the Renaissance, of this moment, because it had two giant consequences for the humanity that lived through it. And the first is the consequence that we remember best, which was this flourishing of genius. This was a moment when Da Vinci and Michelangelo, Thomas More and Erasmus, they coexisted, they co-created, not just incremental changes, but real paradigm shifts in science, in art, in philosophy, to break us out of this medieval moment. This is Copernicus, who took the earth and the sun and traded their places in the heavens, because with math and geometry he had put into human hands for the very first time powers of creation that had always been above us. Not that unlike what we're doing with AI, with genetic engineering today. But this was also a time of flourishing risk, of a scale and speed that upended societies, broke the world. So Columbus connects Europe with the Americas and spreads new pandemics that almost wipe out indigenous populations. And risk flourishes in society too, because the highly unequal consequences of living in this age strain at the bonds that hold us all together. The Inquisition sought to purge Jewish and Muslim influences from Christian Europe. Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. And he struck a nerve of popular anger against a faraway bureaucracy that nonetheless invaded every aspect of people's lives, that in theory served the people, but in practice sometimes seemed simply to fatten its own hierarchy. And the object of his rage, the Catholic Church, was complacent in the idea that they were the permanent symbol of European unity. And then Martin Luther's ideas were spread, printed farther and faster than anyone had seen before, and ignite a protest reformation that breaks the Catholic Church, breaks Europe into Catholic and Protestant halves. And we couldn't imagine that Brexit could happen. Elsewhere in Europe, false prophets seize power from elites. In Florence, which was the heart of the Renaissance, the prophet Savonarola, he whips up popular anger. He lays blame for people's anxieties against an elite that was weak and corrupt. Right? "Oh, Florence, Florence, your cup is full of holes," he said. "But follow me, and I will make this city richer, greater, more glorious than she has ever been." And that's more than 140 characters, so if he were alive today, he probably would have simply said, "I'm going to make Florence great again." Easy line. Sorry, Donald. He ignites a popular bonfire of vanity, right, to reject the liberal values that are threatening his followers' traditional values, and to anoint himself as king. As a historical side note, I suspect that the crowd is going to like this one. He was crucified by his political enemies 4 years later. History, interesting. My point is that, so a year ago, this was already my lens for making sense of the time we live in. And so events that have unfolded, they just continue to make more and more sense. So when you feel overwhelmed about the politics and what's going on in society, don't. Just take a step back. Take a deep breath. Recognize we have been here before. This is a second Renaissance. And like the first, it is a moment of flourishing genius and flourishing risk. And I think that realization should fill us with immense hope. Hope, because somehow the chaos of the first Renaissance gave birth to our modern age. Society unlearned values and behaviors that had served them well in the past, but did no longer, and had to discover new ones, better suited to a radically new human condition. Along the way, the very purpose of economics shifted from subsistence to growth. The very place we sought truth shifted from past revelation to present-day observation. And the very meaning of life shifted from obedience to progress. That was the point of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. So maybe we are in a similar moment. Maybe that's what this is a transition from the industrial age to maybe the knowledge age. And maybe we will profoundly shift our economics, this time from growth to sustainability. Maybe we will shift the very meaning of life, this time from progress to some wider sense of prosperity. Because if this really is a second Renaissance, then the historic opportunity of our age is to usher in the next one. Now that's the hope. But to realize it is going to take courage. Because history tells us that a new world doesn't simply arrive. We have to achieve it. This is the moment we're in. This is what it looks and feels like to be in a Renaissance. And there may be a new world beyond this storm, beyond the fake news and the terrorism and the populism and the fear that the robots are going to take away our jobs. But if there is, no one's ever seen it. No one's ever been there. And to get there, we are going to need to make new maps. Which brings me to the here and now, to all of you in this room. Because the genius that is going to make these new maps, these radical rethinks in how we do our politics, our economics, our science, our business, it's never going to happen here, right? Surrounded by the deadlines and the spreadsheets and the flowcharts of our immediate storms. If that genius is going to happen anywhere, it's going to happen here. And I apologize for using the Canadian wilderness to make this point. I got to represent, I'm sorry. Canadians in the room? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay, great. It's going to happen here, where we leave our left brain world behind and we surrender to the creative potential of our right brain, to intuition, to metaphor, to mindfulness, to serendipity, to surprise. See, you all, I believe, you have the chief map makers of humanity's future in your care, and you have them at just the moment when their creative potential is highest. This is Botticelli's Birth of Venus. If you want to, you can be the wind god Zephyr. You can be the aura of spring, helping to give birth to this genius. Widen the sense of history that you impart to your guests. Make of your places, of your experiences, not just retreats, but crossroads of ideas that surprise their minds into new directions, that connect them to the people who change how the world thinks. We talk a lot about rapid change, about living in a time of disruption, but actually the time we live in is very, very simple. It is a contest between flourishing genius and flourishing risk. Now, I promise you, I will work on mitigating the risk. That's the career that I've chosen. You can help to magnify the genius. And if you do that, and if we do enough of that, then maybe before the fear and the anxiety and the confusion can drown us, we will instead together make of this second Renaissance the dawn of a new enlightenment. Thank you.